If you're a parent, you probably know the drill. You've prepared a nice meal for your family, you all sit down together to enjoy that meal, and then your kid or kids start poking around in the food and declare, I'm not hungry, I don't want to eat this. And how do you respond to that? And that's even more difficult, I guess, if you're invited somewhere and your kid says, I don't want to eat this, I'm not hungry, and there are a couple of ways on how you can respond to this. And I've heard several stories. We've responded in different ways. You can say, well, you're going to, clean your plate, you eat what's on your plate, otherwise you're not going to get up, or you're not going to get anything else, or, just be okay with it. How do you respond to that? And I decided to record this episode and dive more into the nuances of why kids might not be hungry, what is really being hungry versus having cravings, and how do hunger hormones and fullness hormones play into all of that. Welcome to the Primal Shift Podcast. And I decided to record this episode because I recently heard a debate on an Austrian radio station where a mom called in and said, how do I handle such a situation where my kid doesn't want to eat what's on their plate because apparently they don't like it or they're not hungry? And most people who called in said, well, you have to force your kid to clean that plate, to eat what's on the plate because it's good manners. Nobody said, well, maybe if your kid is truly not hungry, maybe your kid shouldn't be eating, because if you eat when you're not hungry, how do you know when you're full? And so it was mind-boggling to see only that one perspective where everyone was concerned about what's good manners. And I'm like, good manners and mealtimes, all of those things that humans have invented that don't necessarily jive with what's going on in the body. And so that's the topic of today's episode. And before we get into it, even if you have no kids, many of the things that I say really apply to adults as well. They apply to humans. And maybe first and foremost, let's talk about hunger and satiety, because there are two hormones in the body that control when you're hungry, that make you feel hungry, and that make you feel full. And those are ghrelin and leptin. And it's smart to listen to those signals from your body, because as I said, if you eat when you're not hungry, how do you know when you're full, when it's the right time to stop eating, And so we should very much listen to those signals and only eat when we are hungry. And from that perspective, I want to point out, again, that applies to adults, but specifically to kids who are maybe a little bit more in tune with their body, that set meal times don't always make sense. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, those are things that we came up with as a culture, I want to say, but that does not necessarily line up with when we are hungry. When we are hungry depends on a number of things. Obviously, a routine. If we always eat at a certain time of the day, then we typically get hungry around that time. We get used to certain meal times. I fully get that. I mean, we eat, in the Kummer household here twice a day. We have a breakfast and we have a dinner. But when we have breakfast and when we have dinner, very often depends on when we are hungry and when the kids are hungry. So don't be too stuck on certain meal times. If you have dinner at a certain time because it's convenient for your schedule and your kid is not hungry, forcing them to eat anyway is probably a terrible idea. But what about, and we've run into the same situation, of course. What if, you have an activity then later on and you won't get home until late, at which time it would not be advisable to have a large dinner, right? We get that. We have the same situation here where we might have tennis practice at from 5 to 6 or from 6 to 7, and we don't want to eat after, or we don't want our kids to eat after because it's too close to bedtime. Well, here is the thing. We need to interrupt this episode for a quick shout out to our sponsor, OneSkin, because let's be honest, nobody wants the skin cells checking out early. It's called cell senescence, when your cells basically start acting old and sluggish. And OneSkin's OS1 peptide is clinically proven to help slow that down. Plus, it's free of those nasty chemicals you'd rather not have hanging around. If you're ready to give your skin some extra love, head over to oneskin.co, that's oneskin.co, and use code MKUMMER for 15% off. Now back to our regular scheduled program before any more cells decide to retire. If the kid is truly zero hungry, it is okay to not eat later either. There are cases where, we have an activity, and if our kids are not hungry before the activity, and we know we come back home late, we tell them, okay, look, kids, we're not going to have a big meal after coming back from the activity because it would butt up too close to bedtime and then you're not going to be able to sleep well. So there are a couple of options. You either don't eat, you skip dinner, and that's perfectly fine. We are not encouraging kids to fast or to abstain from food. We very much try to let our kids eat whenever they are hungry, because they're growing, they need a lot of nutrients and energy, obviously. But it's also okay to occasionally skip a meal. Now, if that activity happens on a periodic basis, like if you have 3 times a week or whatever, a certain activity with that situation, maybe you want to try to shift your mealtime altogether so that the kids are hungry before that activity. But if it's a one-off kind of situation, we've had cases where, well, we're not going to have dinner, you're going to be extra hungry tomorrow for breakfast, and that's fine. Nobody's going to die by skipping a meal. If you are, then there is something wrong with your metabolic health, So that's number one. In addition to, not having fixed meal times that might not line up with your kids' physical needs, right? It's also okay to dislike certain foods, and obviously taste changes. My tastes have changed over the years. Kids' tastes change. What they liked yesterday, they might not like today, and that's perfectly fine. What we try to, they usually know what's for mealtime, so they can have a vote already up front. If they say, you know what, I don't really like this at all. Let's say they, don't like chicken meat, then we'll offer them red meat, or vice versa. The point is, we give them the flexibility to swap out proteins. So from red meat to chicken or to pork to seafood, whatever. What we don't allow is to swapping out protein for carbohydrates, So if they say, well, I'm not really hungry for red meat, but I could eat a bag of Skittles, obviously that's a no-go. If you're truly hungry, then you eat, one of our preferred sources of proteins and, fat, obviously. We do also offer carbohydrates, but we don't substitute something that's essential, like protein and fat, for something that is not essential, carbohydrates, So those are, just some of the frameworks, but within those frameworks, we allow kids to pick something that they like better maybe than something else. Now, not every meal is, the best meal ever where we absolutely love the food because it's our favorite food. No, it is certainly not. But within reason, we allow them to change and swap out. One thing that I've noticed kids very often do or like to do is to say, I'm not hungry, but then they go and eat something else. And what they're really trying to say is, I don't like this, but I'd rather have that. What we've been trying to teach our kids is to distinguish between true hunger and cravings. Now, I want to argue that our kids might have never experienced true hunger. I would argue that most adults, at least here in the United States, have never experienced true hunger. You feel what true hunger means if you have abstained from food for several days. Unless you have done that, you are not hungry, you're craving, and that's particularly noticeable in kids where, they often say, at the end of the meal, oh, I'm full, I don't want to eat anymore. And then Kathy says, well, I made homemade ice cream with raw milk and our own eggs. And I'm like, oh, okay, I'm still a little hungry. You're not hungry, you're just craving that. And it's fine to like certain foods, maybe better than others, but try to teach your kids the difference between hunger and a craving. And teach yourself that as well, so you know the difference. And the best way, again, to find out is to not eat, to fast for a couple of days. And I can tell you one thing, it doesn't really matter at this point what food is on your plate, you just want to eat. It doesn't matter what it is. You're not saying, oh, I'd really want to have, I'm only hungry for this, but not for that. No, you eat whatever is in front of you because you're truly hungry and you need the fuel. And so, same goes with the kids. Once they understand the difference between craving and hunger, it also makes the discussion a little bit easier. Now, one thing that we discourage here is constant grazing. We have, even though I said set meal times might not always make sense, and we are flexible with the meal timing, we eat at certain distinct times when we are hungry. and not in between because we're anxious. I mean, we all do this to certain degrees, but we try to avoid this as much as possible, to constantly eat and to eat like, something 5 minutes before dinner time. Even if it's food, okay, let me maybe take one step back. If we have planned for dinner at 5 and the kid says, I'm really hungry at 3, or at 3 o'clock, the kid says, I'm really hungry, I need something. And the kid is willing to eat protein, let's say, a beef stick or something, then we are probably okay with that because, well, they might be really, if they're willing to eat the protein only and the fat, then chances are they might be truly hungry. And why not eat when you're hungry? Even though waiting is probably not going to hurt, but, before the kid gets cranky, you eat that protein, and then the kid might eat less than when it's dinner time, and that's fine. But what we don't do is we don't allow them unfettered access to quote unquote snacks, even though arguably the snacks we have at home are not terrible and they can typically have what we have at home, what we have in our pantry. We don't buy things that we don't want them to eat, but grazing constantly on food, never giving your body and your digestive system a break, never giving your blood glucose a chance to settle, especially if there are carbohydrates involved, is not a good thing. So we try to eat as few meals as possible. In the case of adults, those are typically 2 meals. In the case of kids, it might be a snack in between if it's a high protein, high fat snack and not something sugary or laden with carbohydrates, So we do allow for that, but generally speaking, the fewer times you consume food throughout the day, the more rest your body gets, and that's generally a good thing. One thing that I should maybe point out is, if you have kids with eating disorders, you might approach the whole situation slightly differently. You don't want to necessarily discourage eating in a kid that already has eating disorders, but the same principle applies. Just because the kid has an eating disorder doesn't mean that I'm going to feed that kid junk food just for the sake of eating. There's got to be a certain framework of what foods are acceptable and which ones are not. But going back to what I said initially, the theme of that episode here is making kids force to eat what's on their plate because it's good manners or because it's time to eat now because we said so. Now it's lunchtime, now it's breakfast time, now it's dinner time. I don't think generally is a good idea. Kids should learn, and you're the teacher, to listen to their bodies. Eat when you're hungry, eat good food when you're hungry, focus on protein and fat, and use carbohydrates wisely. And stay away from anything, obviously, that's processed junk food, processed carbohydrates. They should have no place in your kid's diet whatsoever. But within that framework, allow kids to choose the type of protein that they prefer, the type of fat that they prefer. Maybe they like butter better than ghee or tallow, or whatever the case might be. That's perfectly fine. Within that framework, there should be flexibility. There should be flexibility in terms of when we have dinner, when we eat. If they're truly not hungry, don't force them to eat. We have, especially with our daughter, she is, I don't want to say good at fasting because that's not really something we want to encourage in our kids, but she's very good at listening to her body saying that, you know what, I know you all have breakfast now. I'm not hungry. I'm going to eat later when I'm hungry. And that's perfectly fine. And if that means her having breakfast then by herself a little bit later, that is fine. And she's really gotten to a point where she says, you know what, I love that you made ice cream, Mom, but I'm not hungry right now anymore. I'm going to have it tomorrow. And that is just, it makes us feel like there is at least one thing we did right with our kids, because there are certainly many things we did not. But teaching your kids to listen to their bodies is an incredible tool, because that sets them up for success later in life. So you don't have to be told by a dietitian what to eat and when to eat and how much to eat. You can listen to your body and eat intuitively. Eat what's good for you, eat what makes you feel good, stay away from stuff that doesn't make you feel good, and only eat when you're hungry, and stay away from food when you're not. And if that means having to skip a meal because you're maybe a little hungry later, but it's too close to bedtime, skip that meal. You're not going to fall apart. You're not going to die. It's going to be good for you and for your kids. And with that, we're going to wrap it up. But if you're watching this or listening to this on a platform with comments, let me know how you handle eating with kids. Do you make them eat what's on their plate? Can they do whatever they want to, or something in between? Let me know. I'd love to hear from you, or shoot me an email if you're listening to this on a platform without comments. Until the next episode.
Next time on the Primal Shift Podcast, how do you really know if a food is good for you? We're not just talking science and evolution, we're talking how you feel. Bloating, energy crashes, breakouts. Your body's trying to tell you something. Tune in and learn how to listen.